Having spent the last two sessions considering the secular philosophy of existentialism, in particular as it is found in pessimistic and or atheistic existentialism, and in our last session we considered Christian existentialism, I want to spend some time today in considering the secular philosophy of humanism, with the caveat that there have been times in which Christianity and humanism have converged. Now, humanism is likely the oldest system of thought, the oldest secular philosophy that we will consider throughout this course. However, in philosophy, we typically date the birth of humanism to the pre-Socratic philosopher, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Protagoras, who came up with a motto, Homo mensura. Homo mensura means man the measure. So ultimately, in this philosophy, man becomes the measure of all things. Man stands apart. He is the ultimate norm for knowledge, for understanding. In other words, to accumulate, to come to knowledge, to come to rationality, we begin with man. And I want to take a little bit of time to consider some of the development of humanism in this brief time that we have. In half an hour, it is impossible to not paint with something of a broad brush. However, we will be guilty of that somewhat in this session. So, beginning with Protagoras, again, and then we remember that Socrates exclaimed, "Know thyself." Ultimately, he really thought that even virtue, and civic virtue, it began with the knowledge of the self. You begin with the self, you come aware of who you are, and there begin your journey to knowledge and to truth and so on. But this knowledge will ultimately add to your virtue. Knowledge, to the Socratics and to the Humanists, builds virtue. Now, simply put, in the Greek culture and in the Roman culture, the value system was basically was found within the relationship between the civilian and the state. In the Greek, it's called pilos, P-I-L-O-S. And so when Alexander the Great conquered all of the Western world, essentially, what he really wanted to do was spread Hellenism, essentially spread the idea, the Greek philosophical worldview through the ancient world. They could still continue to worship their gods and so on because the religion wasn't all that important. It was really the relationship between civilian and state. In fact, Socrates, when he was condemned, he was given the option whether he would be exiled or put to death. And he chose death because so precious was the civil life, his connection to Athens, to Greek, and so on. So this idea, this golden age of the Greek age and of the Roman age is really seen through a secular lens. It can be helpful, religion can be helpful, the gods can be helpful and so on, but it is not necessary. It is utterly secular. Now this had a period of pretty much dying out, to put it simply. During the Middle Ages, there was less of an emphasis on humanity. Everything began to be seen ultimately within the eternal. Since we know God is the measure of all things, man somewhat became left out. The common man especially, where in the ecclesiastical system, in the ecclesiastical leadership and so on, this is really where Christian virtue was seen, sadly, until the Renaissance. Now, do you know what Renaissance means? Does anybody know what Renaissance means?
Sort of a revolution.
Well, renewal or rebirth. Now, what they were renewing, or what they were bringing back to the fore, is the classic golden age of Greece and Rome. All of the ancient literature, but especially philology. Specifically, the most famous humanist coming out of the Renaissance, likely anyway, was Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. And we've spoken of him. He was very influential. He had a great mind. He was integral in translating the Latin Vulgate into what we call now the Textus Receptus. This is the Greek translation from which we get our authorized English version, the King James Version. This was all done by Desiderius Erasmus. And he also wrote a diatribe through which he attacked Luther and the Reformation somewhat, and all of the corruption going on in the Roman Catholic Church. And Luther did respond to him through the bondage of the will. But for now, what I want to emphasize at this point is that his disagreement with the Reformation is, again, he was a believer. He continued to be a Roman Catholic and so on. But ultimately, he even said, specifically, the subject of free will must be left off for the academicians in the future. Basically, I refuse to render a verdict as to specifically what free will is and so on. And Luther rebuked him sharply. Erasmus said he wished, being a Christian, he actually wished that he could have the freedom of a skeptic. And Luther, sharply rebuking him, said, "What kind of Christian speaks this way? Spiritus Sanctus non est skepticus." The Holy Spirit is not a skeptic. Neither must the Christian. However, in this blending of humanism and Christianity, ultimately this was an attempt at something of a compromise between the extreme of only seeing everything in light of the eternal and through God, and on the other hand, only seeing it through man. Okay, so in philosophy, we distinguish between philosophies and or worldviews that are anthropocentric and those that are theocentric. Anthropocentric comes from the Greek anthropos, which means man, and then centric should be obvious enough. So this is man-centered, and then theo is God, theos is God, and so this is God-centered. So there are basically philosophies in which promote man-centeredness, and there are philosophies and worldviews that promote theocentricity, basically, where it's God-centered. Now, again, coming out of the Renaissance, though, then came the Reformation and so on, and then came the Enlightenment. Now, it's important to point out the fact that the Enlightenment wasn't monolithic. There were theists as part of the Enlightenment, and there were atheists as part of the Enlightenment. But especially stemming out of the Enlightenment, for the most part, coming out of the Renaissance, going into the Enlightenment, there was still a combination of religion and humanism, and secularism even, but it was just part and parcel of life. It wasn't necessary. In other words, it shouldn't rule your life. Man still rules his life. Just religion becomes part of the aspect of his knowledge and of his life and of his growing virtue and so on. Through the Enlightenment, this changed quite a bit. Through the sciences of the Enlightenment, they came up with spontaneous generation. What they did is they came out and they saw mud puddles after it rained and so on. They say little tadpoles, and they're like, look, life is just generated, ex nihilo. It's coming out of nothing, without scientifically realizing that birds are carrying things, all sorts of different things are bringing these tadpoles into this little pond and so on. So they reevaluated and decided, well, instead of this, well, then it's gradual spontaneous generation. If things are going to come out of nothing, they don't come out of nothing quickly. If something's going to come out of nothing, it must take time. It's just as ludicrous, just as nonsensical, but this is how it went. But ultimately, empiricism, science, was going to save man. In fact, they said that any statement which cannot be empirically verified is not a true statement. In other words, any statement that cannot be proven scientifically isn't a true statement. And it wasn't long before somebody pointed out the fact that that statement would fall by its own weight, because we can't prove that statement scientifically or empirically. In fact, the scientific method is not an empirical syllogism. It is a logical syllogism. But this was the pursuit of the new man. Remember, Nietzsche came out with the Superman. And so the 19th century, coming out of the Enlightenment, humanism was filled with optimism. This was the utopian age. No longer would men write the tale of two cities and so on. We are going to figure this out, each other. This is the age of man. Man is going to rise up above the mythologies and all of the nonsense and being filled with all this nonsense, and really truly rise to his potential, basically. And through the sciences, through technology, basically we are going to grow the virtue of man. We are going to remove all of the suffering of man. This is the new pursuit of mankind. So 19th century humanism was naively optimistic. And then the world, enraptured in this humanism, found itself in the middle of two global wars. Ultimately, there was to be no war, even after the Great War. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And in fact, Adolf Hitler sent to all of his henchmen and so on many of Nietzsche's works. This was a humanistic, secular movement. Communism. Karl Marx said, religion is the opiate of the masses. Basically, it is an illness from which we must be healed. In fact, Sigmund Freud, in his book, In the Future of an Illusion, said about religion, and specifically of his own Judaism, that religion is a mass delusion. It's a collective neurosis which enshrines our infantile longing. Again, this is basically a pathological neurosis from which we must be saved. Incidentally, this is why he would commend things such as sexual immorality, sexual deviancy. Ultimately, now that we must unshackle ourselves from this oppressive God and find our own autonomy. Humanism essentially enshrines and enlifts and exalts the autonomy of man. Autonomy basically just means you're a law unto yourself. Coming from the word nomos, it's autonomy, okay? So you're a law unto yourself. So we must be freed from this. Incidentally, the Humanist Society came out with 3 different manifestos, one in 1933, the other in the 70s, and one as recent as 2003. The first one, the one in 1933, you'll read, and it's, again, very optimistic. It gives all sorts of credits to the religions and so forth. They revealed themselves as religious humanists. Incidentally, humanism was ruled a religion in 1961 from the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, so they commend religion and so on, but we must unshackle ourselves from this foolhardiness. Okay, we must grow as mature men and women and come to the true utopian age. And so ultimately, again, it began very optimistic, and then after these wars, it became very pessimistic, where you see Sartre writing books such as Nausea. Ultimately, this is the condition of mankind. We are utterly hopeless. They saw the naivete of humanism ultimately, as well, actually, because ultimately, humanism let me just jump to something of the conclusion. Let me just reveal to you. I not only think humanism is a weak philosophy, I find it to be absolutely and completely untenable and involves the fallacy of circular reasoning, petitio principii. Ultimately, this fallacy, to put it simply, to define it simply, it's when the conclusion is basically fixed. It's already in the premise of a syllogism. So ultimately, they say that the rationality of mankind, they presuppose the rationality of mankind in order to display it, in order to show it, okay? Because ultimately, Sartre, men like Sartre, Albert Camus and the like, notice is, if ultimately we come from nothing and we go to nothing, you are just presupposing and for no reason whatsoever assigning dignity to humanity. People sometimes confuse humanism with humanitarianism, and these are not the same. Humanism does seek to be humanitarian, but the church, I mean, for all of its faults and so on, certainly we would hope that charity and humanitarianism is part of her character. However, these are not the same. But in presupposing this dignity of mankind, again, the most recent humanists have realized that this isn't only difficult to live. It's not only a weak position, it's an irrational position, which is quite ironic because, again, they are exalting the rationality of mankind while being utterly irrational. And also, through this optimism of especially 19th century humanists going into the 20th century humanists, they were totally convinced that religion would be a thing of the past entering the 21st century. And here we are, and it is not only not a thing of the past, but I believe the humanism is actually the one dying out. Why do I say that? Well, if you talk to people, you'll hear often, too often, that I'm spiritual but not religious. And as faulty as that might be, that is definitely not humanistic. Humanism seems to be dying, and all of the philosophers actually see this. Now, in the time that we have, I want to actually share with you and show you that humanism actually didn't begin with Protagoras. Humanism is probably the oldest philosophy, period, and it wasn't introduced by a human. It was introduced by a serpent. When he asked when he told Adam and Eve, "You shall be as gods." The temptation of Adam and Eve wasn't one of lust, wasn't one of gluttony, wasn't one of theft. It was one of autonomy. All sin is rooted in autonomy. All our lusts of the flesh, all of our gluttony, all of the sin which we seek to manifest, and especially once we are tempted and so on, but especially if we partake of this sin, we ourselves declare ourselves to be God. So, with this autonomy came the fall, and mankind continues to be in this autonomy. And I just want to share with you, incidentally, before I continue this, I want to share with you something that the 20th century humanist Aldous Huxley said. He was born in 1894, he died in 1963. Again, this is a humanist, but he recognizes the weakness of humanism as well, and of empiricism and so forth. Humanism is ultimately also empiricism and materialism, okay? But he said, "We are living now, not in the delicious intoxication induced by the early successes of science, but in a rather grisly morning after, when it has become apparent that what triumphant science has done hitherto is to improve the means for achieving unimproved or actually deteriorated ends. In this condition of apprehensive sobriety, we are able to see that the contents of literature, art, music, even in some measure of divinity and school metaphysics, are not sophistry and an illusion, but simply those elements of experience which scientists chose to leave out of account for the good reason that they had no intellectual methods for dealing with them. In the arts, in philosophy, in religion, men are trying, doubtless without complete success, to describe and explain the non-measurable, purely qualitative aspects of reality. Since the time of Galileo, scientists have admitted, sometimes explicitly, but much more often by implication, that they are incompetent to discuss such matters. The scientific picture of the world is what it is because men of science combine this incompetence with certain special competences. They have no right to claim that this product of incompetence and specialization is a complete picture of reality. This optimistic humanism has absolutely fallen, and I do see humanism in the traditional sense dying out, but they know it's dying out, and so they'll merely redefine it. Humanism was what was absolutely proclaimed and spread throughout the public school system, and in even higher educational school systems, where even traditional Christian universities changed the Department of Theology to the Department of Religion. What's the difference between theology and religion? One is a study about God, theocentric. The other is a study about man. Religion does not, the department or the study of religion is a sociological or anthropological study. It deals with men. It talks about what men do, men and women do. And so this has been influenced, this has come into the church as well. Toward the turn of the 20th century, the theologians capitulating to these humanists and so on, they decided they were only going to read their Bible and strip the Bible of all that is supernatural, because ultimately this is just myths and fables. Again, this is just a presupposition. This wasn't proven. The empiricism falls on its own weight. All of these ideas are nonsensical. Humanism itself is irrational, utterly irrational, yet they just didn't take the time to think of this. They just capitulated to this and became Christian liberals. Now, I hesitate to use the word liberals because everybody has their own ideas, but there's nothing wrong with the word liberal. Historically, this just means somebody who's free thinking, okay? Someone who's open to the truth and so on. But this Christian liberalism became ultimately Christian reductionism, if anything. And so this has found its way into the church as well, where the sermons of old used to be God-honoring, used to declare what God has said in and through his word. Now, it is utterly man-centered. Again, I think there ought to be a balance here. I think we, as human beings, must begin with ourselves. In order to attain knowledge, in order to come to salvation, we must begin with ourselves. So let me go down this trail now. In the Institutes of the Christian Religion, in Calvin's Institutes, he makes it very clear that we begin with the knowledge of the self, then we come to the knowledge of God, because we cannot begin with God. We are not God, and so we must begin with ourselves. So I think the best way of illustrating this is the parable of the running father. If we remember, there were two sons who received the inheritance. The younger asked for the inheritance, but they both received the inheritance. The younger one went and squandered it all on profligate living, just rich living. Got the best camels, went to the greatest dining areas and so on, and just squandered it all. And then finally, he's reduced to working with pigs. This is a Jew who's serving with pigs, and he's not even allowed to eat what the pigs are eating and so on. And so he's suffering greatly. So finally it occurs to him, he came to himself and remembered, in my father's house are servants, not just his sons, but his servants, who have bread enough and to spare. So they have more than enough. Maybe I can return to my father and say, Father, I'm gonna practice this, but Father, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Please hire me as one of your servants and let me just live on as one of your servants. But he came to himself. He came to himself and he realized that he himself was debased. He was his own worst problem. He was his own worst enemy. In seeking the autonomy and seeking the inheritance before it was due him, before it was rightfully his, he still received it by the grace of his father, and he went and squandered it all. And then once he realized this autonomy is the worst thing imaginable, he remembered his father's house. He still, as yet, did not remember his father. And then he returns, and the father, seeing him from afar, runs him down, falls on his neck, weeping uncontrollably, and kissing him all over his neck. He was missing his son. He was praying and hoping for his return. He could not wait. He had no idea where to look. I imagine that father was outside looking every single moment of every single day. But that son who came to himself and practiced, right, rehearsed this little speech, I'm going to give it to my father. Behold the based, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And then he sees his father running him down, the grace and mercy and the love of his father. So he finally saw his father for who his father is. And then at last he saw himself for who he is. The father doesn't respond to him. All the son says at that point is, Father, I have sinned against you, against heaven, and in your sight, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. No more about hiring me out as your servant or so on. That's where he stops. True contrition. And the father doesn't say, yeah, I agree with that. yeah, you really messed things up. You really made a hash of things. He says, go, get the signet ring, get his robe, all the garments of a son, and bring them here. We are not sons and daughters of God because we are worthy. We are sons and daughters of God because he loves us, and he loves us first. So we must begin with ourselves. We of course begin with ourselves, but then we see ourselves for who we are. We come to understand that our own autonomy is our own worst enemy, and that's where we find it. And so maybe we're opened up to go to seek God somewhere. And then we go to church and we are given, we are fed the truth of who he is. The I am who I am. So I'm sure we all remember the story of Jacob and having the dream of a ladder with the angels ascending and descending. And then Jesus makes something of that when he's introduced to Nathanael. Philip brings Nathanael and Jesus says, behold, an Israelite, indeed, in whom there is no deceit. Nathanael says, how do you know me? And Jesus says, surely, before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree. And this alone, Nathanael decries and praises Jesus, you are the Son of God. And Jesus says, surely I tell you, you believe because I saw you under the fig tree? Surely I say to you that you will see angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. I believe that Nathanael was going through something of an existential crisis of his own under that fig tree. I wonder if he was begging and looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, all of the oppression of his people. He's looking around and truly, Jesus declares him full of no deceit. And so I find in Nathanael all the true Christian consternation that we find in this world. And Jesus sees him and reassures him that I am actually the one to come. I am this Messiah. So I believe, and for all that humanism exalts the human and really seeking human autonomy, I think we look to the one of whom it was declared, Ecce Homo, behold, the man. The optimistic humanist really saw the elevation of mankind, really saw man at his apex. I see only one as a man in his apex, and somewhat ironically, he didn't come in royal garbs. He didn't come to a palace. He wasn't born in a palace. He came meekly, came humbly. For all that humanism seeks to exalt mankind, Jesus, the Son of God, was sent in a way to really show that we don't find the elevation, the dignity of mankind in stuff, in material, in technology, even in knowledge. The dignity of man is found in the image of God. So God didn't need to come in all of this regalia, all of this royalty, all of this pomp and circumstance. He came simply, meekly, and lowly. He made himself of no reputation, and he came in the form not only of a man, but of a slave, to serve and to save to the uttermost. This one in whom there truly is no guile, there is no deceit. What Christ said of Nathanael is ultimate when it comes to Christ. So I believe that humanism must fall, and I think it is falling. May Christianity rise through the one true God-man, where we find our nature and who we're meant to be through this one who is altogether holy, the God-man, the Son of God, the Lord of lords and King of kings. May we hear his voice crying out to us, "It is finished." There is nothing more we are to do except to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Yes, we have our services in this life to glorify his great and holy name. This is our privilege. This is our blessed duty. This ought not, well, even if it is from the sweat of our brow and so on, this is a worthy pursuit. This is a worthy worldview. This is abundant life, truly glorifying him and enjoying him forever. This I find to be the true worldview, to be the true way in which we are to view not only the world, but ourselves in the one who is the true I am. Hallowed be his name, now and forever.